supporters believe those lies. They believe those conspiracy theories. And there was a brief shining moment in the state of Georgia where Republican leaders who could have benefited from enforcing those lies stood up and said no. They rejected the argument that our system was subject to widespread voter fraud. They rejected the notion that a conspiracy had led to the outcome. And now they are backtracking on their beliefs. They are backtracking on the public statements they made. Rather than defending the system that they've helped to improve in a modest fashion, they are returning to the worst impulses that Republicans have had when it comes to access for voters. They are returning to voter suppression as a methodology of winning elections, and that is untenable. As the Georgia Chamber of Commerce acknowledged last week in its statement, 33 states have laws similar to Georgia. And in these states, we saw access to voting improve for the first time in a while. It is unconscionable that Republicans would respond to the engagement of voters of every color, of every creed, and across every region of Georgia and across the states of the US by trying to retract and retrench on voter suppression. Because this isn't just happening in Georgia. It's happening in Pennsylvania and Texas and Arizona and more states across the country. We are watching a response to a lie. And the worst response to a lie is to further that lie by embedding it in state law. And so we are here to raise awareness of and to challenge anyone who would provide coverage and worse, provide justification for stealing the right to vote from Americans simply because they didn't like the outcome of the election.
Thank you much, Leader. And so next we will have Marc Elias.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Leader Abrams, for everything you have done to make voting more accessible to everyone in Georgia and around the country. I hope the folks recognize that though much of this call will focus on Georgia, the work that Stacey Abrams and Fair Fight has done has made a huge difference to the ability of Black, brown, and young voters and all voters to vote in states throughout this country. So thank you. So the Republicans in Georgia seem to be wanting to make up for following the law in the general election. Mr. Raffensperger and other Georgia officials in November and December did their jobs. They didn't do more than that. Thankfully, they didn't do less than that. But they did their jobs and applied Georgia law as it is. And the results was that the system worked. There was a hand recount, a machine recount, an audit, and ultimately the election results were certified and recertified. And all evidence pointed that Georgia ran good, clean elections. If there were any problems, it was related to long lines or problems with people having access to voting. But with respect to the integrity of the elections, Republicans and Democrats all agreed that there were no problems. So what are we to make of the current legislative efforts of the Republican legislature? It is nothing more than pandering to the worst instincts of conspiracy theorists who have been spreading lies in Georgia for weeks and weeks and months, and an effort to make it harder for Black, brown, and young voters to vote in a hope that by embracing those conspiracy theories, they will lead to different outcomes in elections in the future. So let's look at some of the specifics that have been proposed. The first, which is frankly breathtaking, is the elimination of no excuse absentee voting. I mean, why on earth would the state of Georgia take an enormous step backwards and eliminate no excuse absentee voting? I mean, seriously, what possible reason could there be to do that other than to engage in voter suppression aimed at voters of color in Georgia and Democrats who voted in higher numbers by vote by mail? It's not to improve the elections, not to improve access to the elections, it's not to improve accuracy of the elections, it's not to prevent fraud in the elections, it's not to make the elections cheaper, it's not to make the elections easier to administer. It is simply to pander to the worst instincts of false and conspiracy theories and lies, and to try to achieve a partisan benefit. It is a shame and would be a black mark on the state of Georgia if they were to take that step. Second is the idea of requiring a photocopy of a voter's ID to request and receive a ballot. Other than increasing incidents of identity theft by making it clear to everyone that a envelope that contains either an absentee ballot request or an absentee ballot also has a copy of the voter's ID, and to undermine confidence in the anonymity or the secrecy of the ballot among voters. Why on earth would you do this? Why? I mean, what possible reason would you have to make someone send in not one, but 2 copies of their ID? There is none. It is simply to impose a burden on voters who presumably most voters don't have access to a copy machine readily available, to make voting by mail scarier, to make it more inconvenient, to increase identity theft risks. There is no good reason to do this. There is no social science that supports it. There's no theory or experience in elections elsewhere to support this radical idea. Third, taking away the ability of independent groups to send absentee ballot applications to voters. Now, let's be clear, we're not talking about third-party groups sending absentee ballots, right? Those come from the state. These are applications. This is simply trying to help people apply for an absentee ballot. Why wouldn't we want everyone to help people apply for an absentee ballot? Why wouldn't we want the schools to send out absentee ballot applications? For post offices to send out absentee ballot applications, for civic organizations to send out absentee ballots applications, for the Boy Scouts to send out absentee ballot applications. Why wouldn't we want everyone to be helping people know that they can apply for an absentee ballot? There is no reason to do that other than it worked in 2020 to increase access to voting and voter participation, and because people vote by mail when they're encouraged to do so. Next, the next proposal is moving up the deadlines on voters' ability to request and a county's ability to send out absentee ballots. Again, what is the reason for moving up these deadlines? There was no problem in Georgia with the existing deadlines. There was no issue in Georgia that the deadlines were too late or that it was causing election administration problems. To the contrary, allowing later deadlines make sure that voters who get sick, voters who are at the last minute don't realize that they need to vote by mail, who have unexpected changes in their work schedule, giving those people opportunity to vote. And allowing the later deadline actually decreases backlogs at the counties. This would actually create a bigger backlog in the counties, which is something we saw in other states that have earlier deadlines. Eliminating automatic voter registration. Again, there is no reason to do this other than making registering harder. Banning ballot drop boxes. I have to say, of all of the things that surprised me in 2020, none surprised me more than the Republican war on ballot drop boxes. Like, I would not have predicted that the Republican Party would look out across America and decide that the problem with voting was that there were too many places for voters to securely return their absentee ballot. And I would not have bet that the Republican Party would believe that only the US Postal Service should have a monopoly on the returning of ballots. It seemed actually quite contrary to Republican ideology generally. So there's only one reason why Republicans are attacking drop boxes in Georgia and elsewhere, which is that it's a convenient way for people to return ballots. There isn't any other reason to oppose them. There isn't any reason why counties can't set up drop boxes, why those are somehow less secure than mailboxes. The banning of ballot drop boxes are a flagrant effort to simply make it harder for people to vote. Simply make it harder for people to have their ballots returned, and to discourage people who rightfully have mistrust of the U.S. Postal Service as a timely deliverer of mail of election mail, to discourage those people from voting. Prohibiting new Georgians from voting in runoffs, that's just unconstitutional. So I don't have any more to say about that other than that just wouldn't be constitutional. And of course, unfunded mandates on counties requiring them to update voter rolls. Why? This is simply to appease conspiracy theorists and waste taxpayer dollars on duplicative efforts and take counties that already have stretched resources and force them to waste money. So here is the deal. We are prepared to fight every Republican attempt to roll back voting in Georgia. We have not been shy about litigating where Republicans overstep and violate the constitutional and statutory rights of voters. And that includes in Georgia. And if Georgia Republicans think that they are going to restrict the franchise and roll back voting rights, and particularly do so in a way that is targeted at Black, brown, and young voters, they have another thing coming. We will see them in court and we will win. We've sued them before and we will do so again. And so I want to make clear to the Republican legislators that are listening, you are doing the bidding of an anti-democratic authoritarian impulse based on conspiracy theories and lies. You should be better than that. You were sent to the state capitol and in government to improve the lives of your citizens. These kinds of changes do nothing other than undermine democracy and victimize the very people you were sent to represent. So thank you again, Leader Abrams, for your inspiration and leadership. Anytime I start to have a down day, and we all have up days and good days and bad days, and I despair about the 100. You read the article, there are 100 voter restriction measures going on in the country. I always turn to Leader Abrams because she has proven that if you just keep fighting every day and you don't let them get you down, we will make progress. So thank you, Leader Abrams, for your inspiration and for having me on this call.
Thank you so much, Marc. And then last but not least, we will kick it off to Margaret, who is the CEO and president of Southern Poverty Law Center Action Fund.
Good morning. It's always a great privilege to stand with my colleagues at Fair Fight. Thank you all for having me on the call this morning. The attacks on the right to vote that we're now seeing introduced in state legislatures across the country, but particularly in Georgia and other Deep South states, are in direct response to the record turnout of Black and brown voters. These efforts also continue to fuel the dangerous voter fraud rhetoric and conspiracy theories that led to the insurrection at the US Capitol on January 6th. In the 2020 election, there was historic turnout, particularly amongst voters of color in the presidential election, and especially amongst Black voters in the Senate runoff. A greater proportion of Black voters returned to the polls in Georgia's January 5th runoff than white voters without college degrees. Black voters took advantage of the voter access laws that Georgia state legislators wrote and passed, laws that were just fine and in fact good until voters of color used them to exercise their power. And because voters of color decided to show their power at the polls, we saw right-wing white supremacists use Georgia State Senate and state House committees to spread disinformation and recruit insurrectionists. Today, we're seeing bills introduced in Georgia that would make it harder for Georgia citizens to vote. Why? Because rather than celebrate the high turnout in our elections, Republicans are trying to restrict the voting rights of Georgians of color. They know it, we know it, and you know it. What's alarming is that their rhetoric about so-called election fraud plays right into the hands of far-right white supremacist conspiracists who stormed the US Capitol. The Southern Poverty Law Center has been monitoring and tracking hate and extremist groups for more than 3 decades. And we spent many hours briefing Georgia elections about the threats of violence, about the risks and intimidation efforts, all through the fall leading up to the elections in November. The SPLC Action Fund is prepared to fight in the legislature and in the court of public opinion to protect the rights of Georgians, particularly the rights of people of color in our state. We're also going to work hard to win the passage of the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, H.R. 4, by the U.S. Congress, which would require federal approval before a law like Georgia's regressive absentee ballot restrictions could go into effect. We're glad to have you all join us this morning, and we look forward to your questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Margaret. So if you all have a question, please raise your hand, and our press secretary, Matt Crack, will be sure to unmute you. So you can press raise your hand with the 3 dots.
First up, we have Mr. Bluestein with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
Guys, can you hear me okay?
We can.
Great. And I guess this could go to Stacey first, Ms. Abrams. If there's a consensus among state Republican leaders, it's about approving new rules to require some sort of verification for absentee votes. I know we've talked about a broad range of issues, but can you talk specifically about that push we might see, a concerted push we might see from Republicans, and why that's concerning to you?
We know that Republicans in 2005, when they first consolidated power in the House, the Senate, and in the governor's office, they were the initiators of absentee ballot usage. They expanded it to no excuses, and they used the signature match process that had been used across the country. They enjoyed the success for more than 15 years. Republicans, or nearly 15 years, Republicans routinely won vote by mail. When you divide it into 3 categories, vote by mail, early voting, and election day, they routinely won vote by mail. The first time they did not win vote by mail was in 2018. That was the first warning flag for them that this secret sauce that they had that ensured their victories, that power was waning. And what we saw in 2020, both in the general election and in the Senate runoffs, was that for the first time, Democratic voters outperformed them in a consistent fashion and by a fairly high margin. The reason they are using this identification strategy is not because there is any fear of fraud. They have routinely said there was no fraud. They independently audited and demonstrated there was no fraud. Brett Raffensperger made his fall debut as a pushback about voter fraud through absentee ballots being nonsensical and not the issue. What they are looking for is to do a redux of what has worked before, which is to use voter ID as a way to push out people whose participation they do not care for. And so this is no different than their impetus for voter ID laws, which they also initiated in that same consolidation of power. This is an attempt to push communities of color and poor people out of the elections process because in their minds, too many people used it. This was made completely clear when the chair of the Gwinnett Board of Elections indicated such. But I think what's more telling is that they are willing to risk identity theft for some of the most vulnerable communities in our state, the elderly, the disabled. These are 2 populations that are the most vulnerable and the least likely to have access to the resources necessary to participate in vote by mail using these proposed systems. And so they would rather sacrifice the ability of older voters and of disabled voters to participate in our process rather than risk losing that portion of an election number. And that should be deeply, deeply frustrating and deeply concerning to everyone. Marc, I think, laid out very clearly why this is an impediment for voting. And we know that when you do this, when you put this type of barrier in place, you may target communities of color, you may target the undesirable voters that Republicans cannot seem to win, but you break the system of democracy for everyone because there are rural white parts of Georgia where this is going to be absolutely untenable. There are going to be communities that have leveraged this method of voting for decades because we have a very high retiree population here in Georgia. They will not be able to participate in the right to vote. And so no matter what the impetus is, the result is what we should focus on. And that is that we will have less secure voting. We will have less secure people who are now going to be subject to heightened voter identity theft, because they're going to be these big yellow envelopes that anyone who's looking to steal your identity, they don't have to sift through and figure out what's a credit card and what's not. They can just look for the vote by mail envelopes to steal the identity of Georgia voters.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we have Ms. Murphy with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
Patricia, you're still on mute.
Can't hear. Nope.
So we can move forward. Patricia, we can come back to you in a second. I'll call on Vanessa Williams, but before Vanessa, if you would like to raise your hand, at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the reactions function on the bottom right. If you click that, you can raise your hand. So Vanessa, go ahead.
Good morning and thanks. My question is, if there are enough votes to pass this, if you're unable to convince or shame them into not doing this, what are the remedies if all this passes? Can you take them to court? I'm just trying to get a sense of if they're going to do this anyway, what do you do to fight back or to push back? Thank you.
Marc, would you like to take this?
Sure. So yes, there are judicial remedies. The court's job at the end of the day is to ensure that people's constitutional rights are protected when political branches target them. And so if the state of Georgia decides that it is going to target African-American, Latino, and young voters with a voting bill that is aimed at making it harder for them to vote, they will be sued. I've been involved in litigation with Georgia Now. In the last year, I've probably litigated 13, 14 cases involving Georgia elections. And I can promise the state of Georgia that if they pass these bills, they will be sued, and they will almost certainly lose. It was in 2013, the North Carolina legislature thought it would be able to do something like this. And it got sued, and the Fourth Circuit struck down their voting restrictions because they found that they, quote, targeted African Americans with almost surgical precision. It is almost as if the state of Georgia has picked up where North Carolina left off and decided that as a makeup to Donald Trump and his crazy band of white supremacist conspiracy theorists, that they're going to now do the same thing. And if they try it, they're not going to get away with it.
Thank you so much. Next, I will call on Aaron Haynes at the 19th.
Hey there, can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Perfect. So Leader Abrams, this is for you. You were in the Georgia legislature. I'm wondering if you feel like there's an opportunity to appeal to your former colleagues on the other side of the aisle, including those who rejected the former president's claims of voter fraud, as recently as last month in Georgia, to reject these proposals that are now in the Georgia legislature, or do you get the sense that they were only concerned with voter suppression as it pertained to their voters?
I think there are people of good conscience on the GOP side of the aisle, and I've worked with them to beat back some egregious attempts to undo voting rights during my tenure when Barry Fleming attempted to dramatically reduce the number of early days for voting to 6. We were able to block that legislation from moving forward. I believe one of the differences we see right now is that there is a national conversation about the direct link, and this is what Margaret was referring to, and I'd invite her into this conversation, the direct link between suborning these conspiracy theories and lies and the insurrection we saw on January the 6th. The people who participated in that, the people who were animated by that have not simply disappeared. They've returned not to the shadows, but returned to their hometowns, including places in Georgia. And we need to be very clear that the extent to which Georgia validates that conspiracy theory, validates those lies, and validates voter suppression as a means of winning elections, that we are then suborning, and I'm using that language very intentionally, the Republicans are suborning their return to power. And that should be something that's untenable. I worked in very strange coalitions during my tenure in the legislature. And fundamentally, if my former colleagues believe in their responsibility to serve every Georgian, they will reject these laws because they know they're not grounded in any legitimate, provable challenge other than they lost an election. And that is not a rationale that should be leveraged in order to change the laws of Georgia. Margaret, I don't know if you want to add on, because I know there was a conversation about the danger faced by elections workers and the fact that we need to be very clear about what's happening here in Georgia.
There's no question that a number of the white supremacist, the hard right authoritarian groups that stormed the Capitol have been threatening elections processes, elections officials, volunteers, and polling places for several months now. And that's not going away. I think one of the challenges we have is that we've seen connections between a number of the extremist groups with the Republican Party. I'll note in particular the Proud Boys, who've had a number of ties with the Republican Party. One of the members who stormed the U.S. Capitol on January 6th ran as a Republican candidate for election to the legislature in Hawaii. And they've also served as essentially security forces for Matt Gaetz when he did an event in the fall. There's traditionally been some soft barriers between Proud Boys and the Republican Party, between other extremist groups in the Republican Party. These barriers are breaking down, and these groups are now becoming the driving force in the narrative of the Republicans, talking about voter fraud, talking about conspiracy. And that should alarm all of us who are concerned about fighting domestic terrorism in the United States.
Thank you so much. And then I believe Matt has Patricia's question that he can read.
Yeah, so I'll go ahead and open this up for y'all. How would the federal legislation, like the For the People Act, interact with the state level changes if both pass, especially related to changes to absentee voting and drop boxes? Would one supersede the other?
Marc, you want to take this?
Sure. Yeah, federal law would preempt state law. So it's a very simple answer. If the federal law, if Congress acts on the For the People Act, HR 1, S1, it would preempt state law with respect to elections where federal candidates are on the ballot.
Now, I will point out that the preemption is absolutely true, but the clarification that he added at the end, the state would have to run its own separate system in order to maintain its current, or to maintain these changes. And that would mean unfunded mandates for every single county and every single elections board, or the state would have to find new money in the budget to pay for a separate and unequal system of elections in order to support their more restrictive approach.
Yeah, I have to say, I didn't even contemplate that the state of Georgia would be that insane. that it would try to bifurcate that, but never let one get by a constitutional lawyer. Yes, that is you are correct, Stacey.
And then I'll take the last question will be from Joyner.
Hi, it's Tammy Joyner. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. It's a combination of questions. How likely are these laws to pass? And is this a return to Jim Crow era tactics? And what can the individual person do to try to become engaged in trying to deal with these issues?
I'll start with the first one. The likelihood of passage depends on the degree of pressure put on these legislators to do what's right. I've seen bipartisan support for rejecting this type of behavior multiple times. And I believe it is within the capacity of our state legislature to say we want to be clear that we support all Georgians and every eligible voter's right to cast their ballots. I believe it is entirely likely that the Speaker of the House and the Lieutenant Governor will say that their partisan victories should not come at the expense of Georgia's Georgia's law and at the expense of Georgia voters. And I've seen that happen. And so I hold out hope until sine die. I would also point out, however, that it takes the pressure of clear reporting. It takes the pressure of making certain people understand what's at stake. And it takes the responsibility of not using false equivalents to either explain or justify what is at stake. This is not, and I will let Margaret address the second part of the question, but let's be clear. These are not common sense solutions. These are attempts to suppress the vote. The president of the United States in 2020 said as much when he, maligned the idea of investing in voting, when he said that Republicans can't win if too many people participate. The chair of the Gwinnett County Board of Elections said the same. The chair of the Committee of Special Election Integrity, the House Committee, Barry Fleming, is the same man who defended having police officers follow Black men home in Hancock County in order to win an election and to steal their right to vote. And so there are bad actors that are currently in our state legislature, but we have to call them out. We have to identify what they have done. We cannot permit misinformation or bad information to become the currency of truth. And we have to hold every single elected official accountable. I am very pleased to see that the Georgia Chamber of Commerce is paying attention. And my hope is that every reporter on this call will continue to focus very, very intently on what's happening in Georgia, but also what's happening in Texas, in Arizona, in Pennsylvania, because what we have just survived has not disappeared. And Margaret's going to talk about the legacy, but let's be really clear. Voter suppression has been baked into American elections since its inception. We focus on the Jim Crow era because it was such a stark departure from who we say we are, but it did not disappear with the end of Jim Crow. And so we have to remember that it is protection of our democracy is an act of vigilance. And that is what we have to call on everyone to engage in, especially those who would benefit from the erosion of our democracy.
Thank you, Stacey. The Jim Crow era led to the Voting Rights Act. And the 2013 decision, Shelby v. Holder, actually made the possibility of returning to these Jim Crow laws happen. If we succeed in winning the John Lewis Voting Rights Act at the federal level, we believe it would absolutely stop laws like these proposed laws in Georgia, because they are so clearly tailored to stopping a particular group of people from participating in our elections. So yes, I think your question is apt, because I think what we're seeing is that Georgia's laws, like so many other laws across the country and especially in the Deep South, are very much targeting, as my colleagues have noted, they're very much targeting communities of color, young people, poor people. These are the people who are being targeted by these laws, and it should be against the law. I will also speak to your last question, Tanya, and you asked about what individual people can do. So many people became active in these elections. So many people demonstrated how much they care about the future of our country by casting a vote. We need all of those people to pay attention to what's happening right now in the state legislature. We need them to look at your articles and your papers and understand the threats that are being posed to our future democratic elections. We need people to call their members of the legislature. We need them to turn out for town halls, and we need them to hold their members of the state legislature accountable to making sure that democracy is protected in Georgia in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. And so with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. If you would like a recording, please reach out to Matt at fairfightaction.com and he can provide. And also, if you have any follow-up questions, you can reach out to Matt as well. Thank you so much for joining the speakers and the reporters. And I hope you all have a wonderful day.